Russia is suffering record losses while its Chief of Staff, General Gerasimov, is indicating that Russia has far further reaching war goals. They actually want to expand the control of territory until Romania. But we'll talk about this as well as about anything else that has happened along the front lines and behind them in this sitrep about the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian SBU is saying Kadyrov has ordered the usage of Ukrainian prisoners of war as human shields, as well as given the orders not to take prisoners at all, but to shoot them in place, and thus clearly once again ordering war crimes. The Ukrainians have struck a power station in Krasnodar, leading to power outages, and the fuel shortages in Russia are spreading into occupied Ukraine now. So Russia is continuing to suffer from the lack of availability of gasoline. The attacks on the Crimea are also continuing. We have the Russian mill blogger Riba here voicing its concern about the increased attacks by the Ukrainians. We'll switch to the developments along the front line, and here from Sumy I have nothing to report, so we switch directly over to the Kharkiv region, and here we have the Ukrainians having advanced in Vovchansk on the western side. Now this area recently the Russians entered roughly 2 months ago more or less, and now we have a geolocation of the Ukrainians having advanced to the northern part here as they were shelled by Russian artillery in this area here. The date of the geolocation is not 100% sure, though, even though the surrounding vegetation indicates that it was kind of recently, but as said, not 100% certain when this video was initially taken. But still, indication that Ukrainians managed to push the Russians out of the western part of Vovchansk. That's it from this region. We switch to the eastern front, and here the Russians have advanced between Kamyanka and Stroivka. Here in this area, the Russians have roughly taken this area here recently. The deep state map is now no longer indicating Mirne as being liberated. Russian mill bloggers are claiming they have advanced in this region, and we do have a geolocation out of the center of Mirne where Russians were showing their flag, indicating that they might have recaptured the town or at least have entered it. As said in the past quite a lot of time, and we'll see this again today, showing the flag is now being used as a propaganda tool and does not necessarily indicate a consolidated control over a certain area. The Ukrainian analyst Konstantin Mashovets is saying that the Russians have entered Kupiansk in the north and the northwest. He confirms that the Russians are in this area, and as we can see, this here is the north and the northwest, and we at least have even the pro-Ukrainian deep state map admitting that these areas are contested. We do have fresh geolocations though, and those are from the center of Kupiansk, or almost the center. All of these positions here, the Russians were showing their flag. So basically on the eastern part, west of the river, up to roughly down here. Now this is clearly geolocated of Russian soldiers showing their flag there. Ukrainian channels claim that this was a PR event to basically show their flag there and that those soldiers were later eliminated. I've seen the videos. I can't confirm that it's actually the same soldiers that are later being attacked. We see a Russian soldier down here on the middle of the road waving the flag left and right, indicating that the surrounding area would be under their control, but to which degree or whether this is just that the Ukrainians didn't see it at that point. This is, as said, something that we need to keep an eye on, where we can't be too certain. The front lines here are known to be fairly slimly occupied, so slipping individual soldiers through that can show a flag behind the own front lines is quite possible and has happened a couple of times in the past. So while this is concerning in regards to the Russians almost having reached the heart of western Kupiansk, this is by far not a confirmation that the Russians are actually in control of that area. All we can do now is basically keep observing it, whether the Ukrainian side is right that this was a PR event and the soldiers were later eliminated, or whether this is true. That's it from this area. We also have the Ukrainians in the town of of Zaporizhzhia. This is the Ukrainians having advanced down here. Now Zaporizhzhia, the Russians recently have entered, and we have the Ukrainians now in the south here on the eastern bank. So showing that the Ukrainians that should have been roughly here at this point, the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians further to the east, closer to the Sherebets River. That's it north of the Seversky Donetsk. South of it, we have something from Serebryansk, the town. Here, a Russian IFV or APC is being hit while entering the town from the west, probably after dropping off soldiers somewhere. This is here at this point, indicating once again that Serebryanka is probably under Russian control. I've shown it to you roughly 6 weeks ago that the Russians had positions all over Serebryanka. Again, not necessarily an indication of permanent, consistent control, but it seems unlikely that the Ukrainians still have permanent positions inside of Serebryanka, and this is once again a confirmation of this. We move further south in the Kostiantynivka region, and we have one change here. We have the Russians in Oleksandro Shultyne. This is geolocated here in the western part of it, where the Russians are now. So this is too early to say that the Russians have captured Oleksandro Shultyne, but it's getting definitely closer to this. So the Russians are advancing inside of Oleksandro Shultyne. In the Pokrovsk direction, we have the Russians in the town of Panivka. Here. Once again, this is a gray zone, so not necessarily an indication of a fundamental change, that we have a geolocation here of the Russians between Panivka and Volodymytrivka. But we also have an interesting video here from Bukivka. Here, a Ukrainian soldier takes out 2 Russian soldiers who think he's one of their own, bypass him, and then he shoots them in the back and basically surprises them. This is geolocated here inside of Bukivka and could obviously be a claim that the Ukrainians captured this. And this is actually what Krimi Caprice, the pro-Russian mill blogger, is reporting. I've seen Ukrainian claims, though, that this was a soldier who had lost contact to his own and was thus able to pop up again in this way. So to me, this is the much more likely explanation, because if those 2 soldiers are on the front line, expect enemy engagement, they'll be far more attentive towards a soldier who claims to be one of their own than otherwise. But if this is actually several kilometers behind the front line, it's much easier for a Ukrainian to mask himself of being a Russian, especially if he speaks Russian. So this makes a lot of sense. So while we have a geolocation of a Ukrainian soldier inside of Bukivka, I do not see that this is an indication of Bukivka being back under Ukrainian control, especially as Ukrainian sources themselves claim that this was a Ukrainian soldier who was cut off before and thus behind the front line by definition. We have the Ukrainians advancing, though, in Novoekonomichne here. These are geolocations. Again, we had them recently here, and we have them here, and we have them further to the east. So Ukrainians are operating inside of Novoekonomichne and continue to do so. The Russians have entered a fortification directly northeast of Selene. This is also geolocated here. In this fortification, the Russians previously have not operated, so this is likely a new area captured now by the Russians directly northeast of Selene. The Ukrainians have re-entered or have shown that they still are inside of Udachne. In the northwestern part, they show their national flag. This again is obviously used for propaganda terms. It just shows that the Ukrainians were here. It doesn't mean that they suddenly recaptured the whole town, but we have visual proof that the Ukrainians are still inside of Udachne. In the Dnipro direction, the Ukrainians had recently liberated Dachne. Now the Russians do the same again and show their flag. So Dachne has a Russian presence in there again. And we have now a visual confirmation of the Ukrainians in Seleny High. This is here. Visual confirmation more or less in the center of Seleny High. In the last sitrep, I reported that Konstantin Mashovets has said that the Ukrainians liberated Zeleny High. Now we have a visual evidence of Ukrainians inside. That does not mean they actually liberated all of Zeleny High, but the deep state map is likely correct that at the very least the northwest of the town is contested, if not under Ukrainian control. Further to the southwest, we have the Russians advancing surprisingly deep north of Robotyne. We have that geolocated here of the Russians reaching this point, and this is on the map here. So quite a bit north of where the Russians recently were. If we take the longest distance, this would be 4.5 kilometers more or less towards the north. This is a fresh geolocation, so apparently the Russians managed to push further north of Robotyne. Overall, that was it with the territorial changes that I can confirm. The confirmations continue to come that VDV units and naval infantry are being sent to the Donbass. It's still unclear in which direction they will focus their interest, but it leads us to the point that we have to expect intensive new offensive attempts by the Russians later this fall. Those units are usually being used where the fighting is expected to be the hottest. So this is a clear indication that the Russians will either focus on Pokrovsk or on the fortress belt or on both, but there will be a lot of additional offensive activity by the Russians. Then we have reports from Ukraine that they arrested the suspect for the killing of the previous parliamental spokesperson, Andriy Parubi. He was arrested and supposedly blackmailed by the Russians to do that. Then there was a report in the Financial Times that Ursula von der Leyen's plane was hit with GPS jamming and that her pilots had to land using paper maps. And while that's impressive, the story is probably not true. GPS jamming reports from the 31st shows that the area here had a GPS interference of 2% or lower. So not to a significant degree that the pilots couldn't see anything anymore. Then the next thing I was told that they don't even carry paper maps anymore. They have them on tablets now if they need maps, especially as carrying maps in and out, and you would theoretically need maps for every potential auxiliary airfield where you might be forced to land as well. That obviously doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And then the claim was that she was circling for 1 hour, while the indication shows they basically circled once. That's it. And the flight time was not exceptionally long either. It was a few minutes longer than was to be anticipated. So I don't know what the Financial Times reported here, but that report seems to not be true. In troop generation and reports, we have something interesting here. The Media Zona, the Medusa and Media Zona, the Russian opposition media are reporting that the Russians have suffered 2,000 killed a week at the height of the Donbass offensive. In total, 93,000 soldiers, Russian soldiers, are confirmed KIA in 2024. In 2023, it was only in quotation marks 50,000. The basis for this calculation was the inheritance cases. They took inheritance cases of young men as an example, and this is an indication how you can indirectly calculate numbers. But we also need to understand that this is a lower limit. The possible number of actual death is higher depending on if they had relatives, etc., or if the relatives did not file claims for inheritance. Also, they have 6 months time to claim inheritance, so the numbers aren't 100% correct, but it shows us, giving us rough estimates of the total numbers. According to their estimates, so far in 2025, the Russians had 56,000 KIA, and all of those are obviously the minimum numbers, and it does not include missing in action either. The Ukrainians said that the Russians have suffered 290,000 men this year alone. This is the claim by the Ukrainians. Russia is also receiving additional aid, though. According to South Korean news, the Russians will receive an additional 6,000 North Korean soldiers, but it's expected that they will not be on the front line, but in the rear area, demining, reconstruction, etc., mostly in Kursk. This would be in accordance to the recently quoted Russian mill bloggers. Troop generation in Ukraine, we have news as well. The Ukrainians have, according to their own accords, built 345 Bogdana self-propelled howitzers since the beginning of the war, in addition to 100 more Bogdana as a drawn artillery. This is important as at the beginning of the war, the Ukrainians had one prototype and no serial production, and now they're closing in on 500 of them being built, the majority of them self-propelled howitzers. Then Gerasimov held a speech, and interestingly enough, in the background was a map, and that map showed that the Russian Federation, according to this, would include not just the occupied territory, but also the western part of Ukraine down to the Romanian border. This was interesting there, as it clearly shows that the Russian military, where the Russian military expects to continue. And the open display of this clearly shows additional territorial claims that can be expected. This is in accordance to what we now have from the Russian president. He said in a press conference in China, a meeting with Zelensky might happen. So that's a first. And he said it can happen if Zelensky comes to Moscow. This would obviously be like Zelensky coming to the aggressor, home to the aggressor, would clearly show the difference in power and the difference in legitimacy and the difference, and showing that those are not two heads of states that are on an equal footing, especially in regards to the fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine and killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians by now. But at the same time, it has to be said that this is probably a smart move from Putin, because he gives Trump kind of what he wants, that he's willing to meet Zelensky, while at the same time avoiding that he has to give legitimacy to both Zelensky as well as to Ukraine. He said that Russia is willing to conquer all of southeastern Ukraine if the negotiations do not lead to Russia receiving it. Basically, once again, he said, give us what we want or we will come and take it. Again, once again, no real admission in any ways, no willingness to compromise. The only thing we've seen at all so far is his willingness to meet Zelensky, if Zelensky is willing to travel to Moscow to do that. Whether or not this is going to happen is obviously unclear. It should be obvious that Zelensky will decline it, but Zelensky so far has shown quite some boldness in various ways. So while I would not expect him to agree to this, I would not rule it out completely either, as he himself would show the US how far he's willing to go to achieve a peace, and thus would put the ball back on the Russian side if he agrees to that. But in the end, we'll have to see. Then we have interesting news from the oil front. Russian gasoline and oil is getting cheaper and cheaper in India. By now, the Indians are receiving $3 to $4 in discount per barrel. Recently, it was just $2.50, so the numbers are climbing up, and it's in itself self-explanatory. With India facing secondary sanctions from the United States, they might still want to buy, but it has to matter. It has to make sense financially. So if everything else gets more expensive, when they keep buying that oil, then that oil needs to be significantly cheaper. So while Trump might not achieve, so far at least, the intended goal of India stopping to buy the oil, he at least achieves one goal, that the Russian profit from that oil is shrinking. Obviously, $3 to $4 per barrel is adding up. With the Indians buying hundreds of thousands of barrels, that is adding up quite a lot. Then Russia and China have signed a memorandum for the building of Power of Siberia 2. This is another pipeline that would allow the Russians to export gas from the gas fields that so far have been exported to Europe. The interesting part is, though, while they have signed a memorandum of understanding, this is not a final agreement on when it's going to be built and who's going to pay for it. And obviously building it will take a decade or longer. So this is going to take quite a long time. While that might be good news on the first glance for Russia, the numbers will matter in the end, because Russia still, the pipeline still has to be built, and whoever pays for it will have to calculate that cost against the gas price. And in the end, it might not be as lucrative for Russia as it looks on the first glance. But that's it for today's sitrep. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment if you have something to add. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.